There is a vacant lot on Buena Vista Drive in Dunedin, Florida, that carries the ghost of something that should not have been there in the first place. The earth is flat and brown, scraped clean by machinery. No plaque marks what stood here. No historical society fought hard enough to save it. But if you dig through the property records of Pinellas County, through the faded photographs in local archives, through the auction catalogs from March 2022, you will find the skeleton of a very strange American story. This lot, worth $4 million for the dirt alone, once held a pink Mediterranean revival mansion of over 7,000 square feet. Hand-painted cypress ceilings, Cuban roof tiles from 18th century Havana, a bedroom containing a four-poster bed supposedly crafted from wood taken from Thomas Jefferson's estate. The house was built as a monument to triumph. It died as a monument to the brutal mathematics of real estate economics. The man who owned this palace was Will Keith. Kellogg. You know his name. You have seen it 10,000 times, printed in red script across boxes of cornflakes in every supermarket on earth. The signature that promised authenticity. W.K. Kellogg. But this is not the story you think you know. Not the cheerful tale of a breakfast revolution, not the myth of American ingenuity served with milk and a spoon. This is the story of what happens when a man who spent 46 years as his brother's servant tries to buy his way into significance. What happens when new money builds a palace in paradise and discovers that paradise has a maintenance cost? What happens when wealth collides with biology, when ambition collides with family, when stone collides with time? This is the story of Kellogg's Florida mansion. Not as it appeared in society pages, but as it actually was. A refuge that provided no refuge, a home that was never truly lived in, a monument that could not escape the gravitational pull of demolition economics. The house lasted 88 years. The cornflakes are still on the shelf. That gap between permanence and impermanence is where the truth lives. If you value investigations into the architecture of American capitalism, the psychology of self-made men, and the cold machinery that determines what history preserves and what it erases, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Not to Florida, but to Michigan. Not to sunshine, but to the sterile white corridors of a sanitarium where a boy was being trained for a role he would spend his entire life trying to escape. 1. The brother who was supposed to disappear Battle Creek, Michigan. 1860. The Kellogg household was not a home. It was a training facility for righteousness, Seventh-day Adventists, strict, disciplined, suspicious of pleasure in all its forms. The family creed, work is prayer, idleness is sin. The body is a temple that must be kept pure, even if that purity feels like punishment. Into this environment, on April 7, 1860, Will Keith Kellogg was born, the seventh son. An afterthought in a family already crowded with obligations and expectations. His older brother, John Harvey Kellogg, born 14 years earlier, had already claimed all the oxygen in the room. John Harvey was brilliant, charismatic, a child prodigy who could recite Bible verses before he could properly walk. By the time Will Keith was learning his alphabet, John Harvey was already being groomed for greatness, sent to medical school, destined to become a physician and a prophet of a new American religion, health through suffering. Will Keith, by contrast, was slow. He struggled in school. Teachers noted his inability to focus, his poor performance on basic reading tasks. He squinted at the blackboard. He held books inches from his face. No one checked his eyes. No one considered that the boy might need glasses. The diagnosis, delivered casually by family and teachers alike, was simpler: stupid. And Will Keith believed them. This is where his story begins, not with ambition, but with shame. A child internalizing the label of inadequacy, carrying it like a stone in his chest. By 1880, when Will Keith was 20 years old, the gap between the brothers had become a canyon. John Harvey Kellogg was now Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, superintendent of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a health resort that attracted the wealthiest hypochondriacs in America, a place where the rich paid extraordinary sums to be tortured in the name of wellness. The sanitarium was John Harvey's kingdom: hydrotherapy, electrotherapy. Extreme diets based on the theory that most diseases originated in the colon. Patients ate bland vegetarian meals, submitted to daily enemas, abstained from sex, caffeine, alcohol, and anything that might be construed as enjoyable. John Harvey himself never consummated his marriage, believing that sexual activity drained vital energy from the brain. This was the world Will Keith entered, not as a patient, as a laborer. John Harvey hired his younger brother to manage the sanitarium's business affairs: bookkeeping, purchasing, maintenance, the unglamorous machinery that kept the operation running while the great doctor held court with Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and other titans who came seeking the secret to longevity. Will Keith's title was business manager. His reality was servant. For 25 years, from 1880 to 1905, Will Keith Kellogg lived in his brother's shadow. He worked 16-hour days for a salary that barely exceeded that of a janitor. He took dictation in the middle of the night when John Harvey was struck by an idea. He ran alongside his brother's bicycle, notebook in hand, writing down instructions while trying not to trip. John Harvey treated him not as family, but as furniture. Useful, replaceable. Will Keith was in his 40s before he understood that the diagnosis he had received as a child, stupid, was wrong. He was not. Intellectually deficient, he had been systematically broken. But something else was happening during those 25 years of humiliation. Will Keith was learning, not medicine, not oratory, not the performance of genius. He was learning how systems work, how money flows, how to manage inventory, negotiate with suppliers, balance budgets. He was learning the invisible architecture that holds empires together. And he was watching his brother's patients, watching them choke down the tasteless whole wheat biscuits prescribed by Dr. Kellogg, watching them pretend to enjoy food designed to be punishment, watching the gap between what the doctor preached and what the patients actually wanted. John Harvey believed food should be medicine, bland, joyless, functional. Will Keith saw something different. He saw desire. He saw the human need, not just to survive, but to experience pleasure. This was the crack in the foundation, the place where the empire would split. 2. The grain that changed everything, and the war that followed, 1894. The sanitarium kitchen, late at night. The Kellogg brothers were experimenting with boiled wheat, attempting to create a digestible bread substitute for patients with damaged teeth. The wheat was cooked, then supposed to be rolled out while still moist. But they were called away. An emergency. The grain sat out overnight, drying, beginning to ferment. When they returned and ran the dried wheat through the rollers anyway, expecting a disaster, the grain did not compress into dough. It shattered into thin individual flakes. They baked these flakes, tasted them. The patients tasted them. The response was immediate. People liked them, not in the medicinal sense. They actually liked them. John Harvey saw a therapeutic food. Will Keith saw revolution, but there was a problem. The flakes, as John Harvey insisted they be served, were aggressively bland. They tasted like toasted cardboard. Patients ate them out of obedience to the doctor, not out of desire. Will Keith proposed the forbidden ingredient, sugar. John Harvey's response was volcanic. Sugar was poison. Sugar was the devil substance. Sugar represented everything wrong with American excess. To add sugar to a health food was heresy. The argument that followed was not about a recipe. It was about worldview. John Harvey represented the old Puritan America, where virtue came through deprivation. Will Keith represented the new commercial America, where virtue came through providing what people wanted and charging them for it. They could not both be right. Will Keith was 46 years old. He had spent a quarter century doing what he was told. He had absorbed insults, worked for poverty wages, sublimated his own intelligence. He had been the good younger brother. He decided to stop. On February 19, 1906, Will Keith Kellogg founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company. Not wheat flakes, cornflakes. He had moved on from his brother's experiments entirely, and he did the one thing John Harvey found most offensive. He added sugar. Not much, just enough to make the product appealing, enough to turn medicine into pleasure. John Harvey was not just angry, he was betrayed. His own brother had taken the family name, the Kellogg name, and attached it to a commercial food product. This was desecration. The war began immediately. John Harvey launched his own cereal company, trying to compete using the authority of his medical credentials. He marketed his version as the authentic, doctor-approved Kellogg cereal. Customers were confused. Two products, same name, different philosophies. Will Keith's response was strategic and ruthless. He sued his brother. He took the man who had employed him, humiliated him, underpaid him, and he dragged him into court. The case went all the way to the Michigan Supreme Court. At stake was the question, who owned the name Kellogg? Will Keith won. The court ruled that Dr. John Harvey Kellogg could use the family name for his sanitarium and medical products, but not for commercial cereals. That market belonged to Will Keith. To protect his product from imitators, including his own brother, Will Keith did something unprecedented. He put his personal signature on every box, in red ink, W.K. Kellogg, with text below, "Beware of imitations, none genuine without this signature." Every box was now a legal document, a brand, an identity. John Harvey Kellogg, the famous doctor, the man who had dined with presidents, was erased from breakfast tables across America. Will Keith Kellogg, the stupid younger brother, owned the morning. But victory has a cost that accountants do not measure. The brothers never reconciled. They did not speak for years. When they passed each other on the streets of Battle Creek, they looked away. Will Keith had won the empire, but he had lost his family. This wound, this severance, this cold silence where brotherhood used to be, it would shape everything that came next, including the house in Florida. 3. How to spend money. When you have forgotten how to live by 1920, Will Keith Kellogg was unimaginably wealthy. His factories operated around the clock. The signature on the box was more recognizable than the president's. Money flowed in faster than it could be counted. He was 60 years old. He had worked every day of his life since he was 14. He had defeated his brother, defeated his competitors, built something that would outlive him by centuries. And he had absolutely no idea what to do with himself. He did not drink, did not gamble, did not chase women. His marriage to Ella Osborne Davis, which had lasted decades, was functional but cold. His hobbies were limited to work and more work. The American script for men of his class was clear. If you make your fortune in the North, you build a palace in the South. Florida in the 1920s was in the grip of the greatest real estate bubble in American history. Land prices doubled every month. Speculators sold swampland as future paradise. Developers drew maps of cities that did not exist and sold lots to people who would never visit. Fortunes were made on paper, lost overnight, made again. Into this chaos came serious money. Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Fords. They built estates on the coasts, mansions designed not for year-round living, but for seasonal display. Winter playgrounds where the northern elite could demonstrate their permanence in a landscape of sand and heat. Kellogg, who understood trends, who understood what success was supposed to look like, decided he should do the same. not because he wanted a house in Florida, but because that was what men of his stature did. He was looking for meaning. He found real estate. Enter Edward Frischkorn, a developer from Detroit with vision exceeding his capital. Frischkorn had purchased land in Dunedin on the Gulf Coast and planned an ambitious project. Dunedin Isles, golf courses, hotels, waterfront estates, a second Riviera for the Midwest. Rich. Frischkorn needed an anchor investor, someone whose name would attract others, someone with money to burn. Kellogg was the perfect mark, not because he was foolish, but because he was empty. He had wealth and no purpose. Frischkorn sold him not land, but identity. Construction on the Villa Marina began in the mid-1920s. The location, a plot on Buena Vista Drive, directly on St. Joseph Sound, with unobstructed views of the Gulf of Mexico. The architecture, Mediterranean revival, the fashionable style of the moment, designed to evoke the aristocratic estates of Spain and Italy. The house was not large by modern mansion standards, just over 7,000 square feet, but every inch was expensive. Hollow clay block construction, cutting edge for fire and moisture resistance. Pink stucco exterior, the color of seashells. Hand-painted cypress ceilings, each beam a work of art requiring hundreds of hours of labor. Floors of rare imported tile. Roof tiles shipped from Cuba, salvaged from 18th century buildings in Havana to give the house a patina of age it had not earned. This was new money pretending to be old money. Kellogg, the man who had been called stupid, who had run beside his brother's bicycle, was building a house that looked like it had belonged to Spanish nobility for 300 years. The cost was not disclosed, but property records and construction documents suggest a figure approaching $500,000 in 1920s currency, roughly $7 to $8 million today. But then the music stopped. October 1929. The stock market collapsed. The Great Depression hit like a tidal wave. Frischkorn's Dunedin Isles project disintegrated. Investors fled. The grand vision of a southern Riviera turned into empty lots and unfinished roads. Edward Frischkorn's partner, Austin Seltz, who held title to the Villa Marina, was drowning in debt. The house had been completed, but never properly lived in. It was a white elephant, a monument to optimism in a time of despair. Kellogg, however, was thriving. While other businesses collapsed, people still needed breakfast. In fact, during the Depression, cornflakes became more popular. They were cheap. They filled children's stomachs. The Kellogg Company did not suffer. It grew. In 1934, Will Keith Kellogg made his move. He bought the Villa Marina from the desperate Austin Seltz. The purchase price was not publicly recorded, but local historians estimate it at a fraction of construction cost, somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000. Kellogg had purchased a palace at liquidation prices. He bought another man's dream after that man had been broken by economic reality. This was the cold arithmetic Kellogg understood. Value is not intrinsic. Value is determined by the desperation of the seller and the patience of the buyer. He now owned a house in paradise, a refuge, a symbol of having arrived. The only problem was that he did not want to be there. 4. The furniture of a life that was. Never live step inside. 1935. The Villa Marina is now the property of Will Keith Kellogg, and it looks like a museum that forgot to open. The front entrance, massive oak doors, imported, heavy enough to require 2 hands to push open. They swing inward to reveal the main hall, a space designed for crowds that will never arrive. The floor is a mosaic of colored tile, geometric patterns that echo Moorish design. Cold underfoot. Each step produces a hollow echo that emphasizes how empty the house is. Above, the famous ceilings. Pecky cypress beams, hand-painted with intricate patterns by artisans brought in from the north. The cypress itself has a unique texture. eaten by a specific fungus that creates pockmarks and whorls, turning ordinary wood into something visually complex. This was expensive wood made more expensive by labor. The beams span the length of the main hall and extend into the adjoining rooms. Each one is a demonstration of excess, not because the structure required such heavy beams, but because they signaled permanence, wealth, taste. The furniture inside is a strange mix. Some pieces are genuinely antique, purchased by Kellogg staff from estates and auctions. Others are high-quality reproductions designed to blend in. The goal was not authenticity, but the appearance of lineage. The house was supposed to look like it had been owned by the same family for generations, even though it was built 5 years ago. The dining room, a long table that could seat 20. Hand-carved chairs with velvet cushions. A chandelier of Venetian glass that required a custom support in the ceiling to bear its weight. The silverware is monogrammed. The china is European. But the menus served at this table were modest. Kellogg retained many of his brother's dietary habits despite their hatred for each other. Simple meals, whole grains, minimal seasoning. He had spent his fortune on sugar, but did not eat it himself. The contradiction was everywhere, a palace of indulgence, inhabited by a man of restraint. The living room featured floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Gulf. The view was the real luxury, the light, the water, the sense of openness. This was what the house was built to frame, but Kellogg did not spend his time gazing at the view. His vision was failing. By 1935, he was in the early stages of glaucoma. The disease progresses slowly, stealing peripheral vision first, then narrowing the world into a tunnel, then into darkness. He could still see during the day, but details were blurring. Colors were fading. He had built one of the most beautiful houses in Florida, and he was going blind. The bedrooms were upstairs. 5 of them, each with its own bathroom, a luxury in that era. The master bedroom contained the centerpiece of Kellogg's personal mythology, the 4-poster bed. This bed, according to persistent legend, was constructed from wood salvaged from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello estate. Whether this was true or simply a story Kellogg's, staff told visitors, is unclear. The documentation is thin, but the belief was what mattered. Kellogg, the son of poor Adventists, the servant who ran beside his brother's bicycle, slept in a bed that had supposedly belonged to the author of the Declaration of Independence. Every night he climbed into that bed and closed his eyes. What did he think about? Did the symbolism comfort him? Or did it remind him how far he still was from being accepted by the people whose approval he sought? The house was wired with the latest electrical systems. Modern plumbing, a heating system for the few cool winter nights, a full staff, housekeepers, gardeners, a cook. The grounds were manicured. The boathouse down by the water was stocked with vessels Kellogg rarely used. Everything was ready. Everything was in place. But the house had a problem. It had no life. Kellogg did not throw parties. He did not host charity balls. He did not fill the rooms with the laughter of grandchildren. The Villa Marina was a stage set waiting for a play that would never be performed. And then, the cruelest irony of all. As his glaucoma progressed, the visual splendor he had paid for became inaccessible. He walked the halls by touch. He felt the texture of the painted beams with his fingers. The pink stucco, the imported tiles, the view of the Gulf, all of it faded into a gray fog. He had bought beauty and lost the ability to see it. By 1937, only 3 years after purchasing the house, Kellogg understood something fundamental. Ownership was not the same as belonging. Bricks were not the same as home. The Villa Marina was a monument to a life he had imagined but never actually lived. And maintaining that fiction was becoming unbearable. 5. The son, the grandson, and the unforgivable sin. While the Pink Palace stood empty in Florida, the real drama was unfolding in Michigan, in boardrooms and lawyers' offices, in the cold machinery of family destruction. Will Keith Kellogg had 3 children, Carl, John Leonard, and Elizabeth Ann. Of the 3, John Leonard, known simply as John, was the heir, the one groomed to take over the empire. John had worked alongside his father since the company's founding. He understood the business. He was competent, disciplined, loyal. He had spent his 20s and 30s doing what his father had done for his uncle, serving without complaint. But John wanted something his father considered unforgivable. He wanted a personal life. In the early 1930s, John divorced his first wife and remarried. The details of why are lost to family privacy and the discretion of that era. But the fact of divorce was enough. Will Keith Kellogg, a man who had destroyed his relationship with his own brother over a business disagreement, could not tolerate what he viewed as moral failure in his son. Divorce was weakness. Divorce was scandal. Divorce was a stain on the family name that he had spent decades purifying. In 1933, Will Keith fired his son from the company. Not demoted, not reassigned. Fired. Removed from the business they had built together. Then he went further. He cut John out of his will. The son who had been the presumed heir was erased. This was not a private family matter. This was public. Business circles in Battle Creek knew. The message was clear. Loyalty to Will Keith Kellogg's moral code was more important than blood. John Leonard Kellogg's life collapsed. He had been raised to run the company. His identity was tied to the Kellogg name, just as his father's had been. Now he was cast out, cut off, humiliated. And there was a child caught in the middle. Kenneth, John's son, Will Keith's grandson. Kenneth grew up in the wreckage of this family war. The details of his childhood are fragmented, protected by the silence that wealthy families can afford. But the outline is clear. He was unstable. He struggled. He had access to money, but not to stability. In later years, Kenneth fell from a second-story window. Accounts differ on whether it was an accident, a suicide attempt, or something else. He survived, but was permanently disabled. Will Keith Kellogg, upon hearing the news, reportedly said very little. He did not reconcile with his son. He did not bring his grandson into the fold. He maintained his position. This is where the mythology of the benevolent industrialist crashes into reality. Will Keith Kellogg was, by all external measures, a philanthropist. He gave millions to charity. He funded schools and hospitals. He created a foundation that still operates today with billions of dollars in assets. But he could not forgive his own son for being human. The Villa Marina, sitting empty in Florida during these years, becomes a symbol of this emotional void. Kellogg owned a house with 5 bedrooms designed for a family, but he had systematically severed the relationships that would have filled those rooms. He tried to replace biological family with institutional family. In 1930, he established the W. K. Kellogg Foundation, initially funded with his personal stock in the company. The foundation's mission was to help children, other people's children, gain access to education and health care. He could not fix his own family, so he decided to fix the world. In 1937, only 3 years after buying the Florida mansion, Kellogg made a decision that shocked the small social world of Dunedin. He donated the Villa Marina to his foundation. Not sold. Donated. He signed over the deed to the house he had barely lived in, the house he could barely see, the house that was supposed to represent his arrival into the leisure class. Why? Because it had failed its purpose. The house was supposed to make him happy, supposed to provide a refuge, supposed to be the reward for decades of labor. Instead, it was a reminder of everything he had sacrificed and lost. Better to give it away. Better to let it serve some function, even if that function was unclear. The foundation accepted the property, unsure what to do with it. A mansion in a small Florida town had limited use for a charitable organization focused on child welfare and education. The Villa Marina entered limbo. It was no longer a private residence. It was not yet a public institution. It simply existed, staffed and maintained, waiting for a purpose. Kellogg left Florida and returned to Battle Creek. He was now almost entirely blind. He would live another 14 years, but those years would be spent in darkness, dictating letters, managing his foundation from a distance, severing himself further from the world. The house remained an orphan. The walls did not care about their owner's intentions. The pink stucco absorbed the sun. The cypress beams aged. The Gulf waters continued their eternal motion, indifferent to human drama. And then the war came, and everything changed again. 6. The Marines, the disco floor, and the slow rot of grandeur. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America entered the war, and the machinery of conflict reached even into the quiet corners of Florida. Dunedin, a sleepy town known for oranges and fishing, found itself on the edge of something much larger. Just outside of town, the eccentric inventor Donald Roebling was developing a strange machine, the Alligator, an amphibious vehicle that could transition from land to water. The military saw potential. Roebling's workshop became a testing ground. The U.S. Marine Corps established a presence in the area. Officers and trainers needed housing. Hotels were full. Private homes were inadequate. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which now owned the Villa Marina but had no clear use for it, offered the house to the military. The government accepted, and so the Pink Palace became a barracks. The hand-painted ceilings looked down on soldiers in uniform. The dining room table, which had hosted almost no one during Kellogg's brief ownership, now seated Marines eating standard-issue rations. The bedrooms were converted into sleeping quarters for multiple men. The boathouse became storage for equipment. The transformation was total. The house that had been designed as a symbol of refined wealth was now a functional military installation. There is something poetic in this. The building that Kellogg bought to escape his past, to separate himself from the industrial grit of Michigan, was now filled with young men being trained for violence. The house built for leisure was serving necessity. The war ended. The Marines left. The house was returned to the foundation in 1945, scuffed and worn. The foundation, still uncertain what to do with the property, decided to sell. In 1946, the Villa Marina was purchased by William and Carolyn Nolan for $63,500. Adjusted for inflation, roughly $900,000 today. A steep discount from what Kellogg had paid in 1934 and a fraction of what the house had cost to build. The Nolans lived there quietly for nearly 2 decades. They were not socialites. The house was simply a home, perhaps too large, but comfortable. Then, in 1964, the house changed hands again. The new owner was William Matthews, a man whose vision for the Villa Marina was radically different from anything that had come before. Matthews looked at the austere Mediterranean revival interiors and saw an opportunity for improvement. He decided to modernize, to add personality. The result was the infamous disco room. Somewhere in the mid-1960s, Matthews installed a floor that glowed, panels that lit up in patterns designed to evoke the dance floors that were becoming popular in urban nightclubs. He added mirrored tiles to the ceiling in one room. He painted walls in bright colors that clashed with the original palette. This was not restoration. This was reinvention. Matthews turned Kellogg's Temple of Seriousness into a venue for parties. The house that had known only silence and military efficiency was now wired for sound systems and colored lights. Architectural purists were horrified. Locals were amused. The Villa Marina became a curiosity, a place people talked about not because of its history, but because of its weirdness. Matthews owned the house for decades. After him came other owners, each leaving their mark, some tasteful, some less so. The house drifted further from its original identity. By the time James Nielsen purchased the property in 2003, the Villa Marina was a patchwork. Some rooms retained the original grandeur. Others looked like they belonged in a different building entirely. Nielsen tried to maintain the house, but maintenance costs were staggering. Florida's climate is merciless. Humidity rots wood. Salt air corrodes metal. Termites eat through beams that were supposed to last centuries. The roof began to leak. The plaster cracked. The electrical system, updated multiple times over the decades, was a tangled mess of old wiring and newer patches. Asbestos, used in construction in the 1920s, was discovered in the walls. Removing it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then there was the simple fact: the house was too big for modern use. 7,000 square feet is expensive to heat, cool, and maintain. The property taxes in a waterfront location are brutal. Nielsen held on to the house as long as he could, but by the late 2000s, the math was clear. The Villa Marina was a money pit. It was costing more to maintain than it could ever generate in value. In 2021, Nielsen put the house on the market. Asking price, $4 million. But that price was not for the house. That price was for the land. The structure itself was valued at zero. Real estate agents were blunt with potential buyers. If you purchase this property, you will tear the house down. Restoration is not feasible. The cost to bring the building up to modern safety codes, to remove the asbestos, to repair the structural damage would exceed $10 million. Far more than the value of the finished product. The market had spoken. The Villa Marina was worth less than the dirt it sat on. David Wenk, a developer, bought the property in late 2021. He had no illusions. He was not buying history. He was buying a waterfront lot in a desirable location. The house was an obstacle to be removed. Preservationists mobilized. Petitions circulated. Local historians gave interviews explaining the significance of the Kellogg mansion. Social media posts lamented the loss of architectural heritage. But none of the people signing petitions offered to pay for the restoration. None of the historical societies had the budget to take on the project. The city of Dunedin had no interest in acquiring a property that would drain resources for decades. The economics were simple and brutal. The house could not be saved because no one valued it enough to pay the price of saving it. In early 2022, the demolition permit was issued. The Villa Marina had 3 months left to exist. 7. The auction, the excavator, and what remains, March 2022. The end is a spectacle. Before the demolition, an auction is held. Everything inside the house that can be removed is put up for sale. Furniture, light fixtures, tiles, sections of the hand-painted cypress beams cut into pieces. The 4-poster bed, the one allegedly made from Thomas Jefferson's estate, sold to the highest bidder. The event has the atmosphere of a wake and a looting simultaneously. People walk through the empty rooms, taking photographs, touching the walls one last time. Then they bid. Aggressively. A brass doorknob sells for $200. A section of decorative plaster, chipped and fragile, goes for $500. The Venetian glass chandelier from the dining room fetches several thousand. The house is being dismantled and distributed. The physical structure that was supposed to stand for centuries is being reduced to souvenirs and spare parts. Some buyers are genuine preservationists, hoping to incorporate pieces of the mansion into their own homes, keeping the history alive in fragments. Others are flippers, planning to resell the items online at a markup. History as commodity. The auction lasts 2 days. When it is over, the Villa Marina is a shell. Bare walls, exposed wiring, empty rooms echoing with absence. Then the machines arrive. A yellow Caterpillar excavator. A crew of workers in hard hats who see this as just another job. They have demolished dozens of buildings. This one is no different. except for the small crowd of onlookers standing across the street, filming with their phones. The excavator's arm swings. The steel bucket crashes into the pink stucco. The wall crumbles. Dust rises. The cypress beams, the ones that took hundreds of hours to paint, snap like kindling. It takes less than a week to reduce the Villa Marina to rubble. The house that was built to last 300 years is erased in 5 days. The debris is sorted. Some materials are recyclable. The wood, what is not rotted, is chipped for mulch. The tiles are broken and discarded. The foundation is jackhammered into chunks and hauled away. By the end of March 2022, the lot is flat. Brown dirt, a few scraps of pink stucco half buried in the soil. No marker, no plaque. Nothing to indicate that anything significant ever stood here. David Wenk, the developer, has plans for the lot. A new house, modern, energy efficient, smaller than the mansion but more functional. Something people will actually want to live in. The past is gone. The future is a blueprint. This is where most stories end. The mansion is demolished. The history is lost. We shake our heads and move on. But that is not the real ending, because the Villa Marina was always a symbol, not a substance. And symbols do not die when their physical forms are destroyed. They transform. 8. What money can buy, and what it cannot let us be precise about what happened. Will Keith Kellogg, born into poverty and shame, spent 46 years serving a brother who treated him like a tool. At age 46, he rebelled. He built an empire that changed how the entire world eats breakfast. He became one of the wealthiest men in America. He bought a mansion in Florida, a palace that was supposed to prove he had transcended his origins. He owned the house for 3 years before giving it away. He lived in it for a total of perhaps a few months, scattered across those 3 years. He was blind before he could fully enjoy the beauty he had paid for. He died in 1951 at age 91, having outlived most of his enemies and most of his family. He was buried in Battle Creek, not in Florida. The house he bought as a monument to his success lasted 88 years before being demolished for economic reasons. This is the story of what money can buy. Real estate, craftsmanship, materials imported from across the world, labor, space, a view of the Gulf. And this is the story of what money cannot buy. Happiness, family, belonging, vision when biology takes it away. Time, forgiveness. The Villa Marina was an attempt to purchase legitimacy. Kellogg wanted to be accepted by the leisure class, the people who summered in Newport and wintered in Palm Beach. He wanted to erase the memory of the boy who ran beside his brother's bicycle. He succeeded in becoming wealthy. He failed in becoming accepted. Old money never truly welcomed him. His name was on cereal boxes, not in the social registers that mattered. He was a manufacturer, not an aristocrat. The mansion did not change that. It only highlighted the gap. But here is the twist. The real legacy of Will Keith Kellogg has nothing to do with the house. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the institution he created to replace the family he could not fix, is today one of the largest charitable foundations in the world. Its assets exceed $8 billion. It funds education, health care, and food security programs across the globe. Every year, millions of children benefit from grants and initiatives funded by money that originated in boxes of cornflakes. The foundation operates in dozens of countries. It employs thousands of people. It will continue operating long after everyone who remembers the Villa Marina is dead. This is the monument that lasts, not stone and plaster, but systems and institutions. The signature on the cereal box, the one Kellogg put there to defeat his brother, is still there. Walk into any supermarket on earth. You will see it. W.K. Kellogg. Red script. A promise of authenticity. That signature has outlived the man, the mansion, the family feuds, the glaucoma, the bitterness. It has become permanent in a way that no building ever could. The Villa Marina was demolished because it was not economically viable to save. This is the correct decision by the logic of capitalism, the same logic that built the Kellogg empire in the first place. Buildings are assets. Assets must generate returns. If they do not, they are liabilities. Liabilities are eliminated. Will Keith Kellogg, were he alive, would have understood this perfectly. He was a man of ruthless efficiency. He would have looked at the restoration estimates, the maintenance costs, the lack of viable use, and he would have signed the demolition order himself. He did not build the house to create a museum. He built it to escape loneliness. It failed. He moved on. The people mourning the demolition of the mansion are mourning something that never actually existed. They are mourning the idea of a kinder, slower America where history is preserved and beauty is protected. But that America is a fantasy. The real America, the one Kellogg helped build, is a machine that devours the past to fuel the future. Cornflakes are not a traditional food. They did not exist before 1894. They were invented, marketed, and distributed using industrial methods that destroyed older ways of eating. Kellogg made breakfast faster, cheaper, more convenient. He eliminated the need for cooking. He turned a meal into a transaction. This is the same force that demolished his mansion. Progress, efficiency, economics. The Villa Marina fell victim to the system its owner helped perfect. 9. The lot, the memory, and the signature that endures today. If you drive down Buena Vista Drive in Dunedin, you will pass lot 129. It is empty. The grass is growing back. There are no construction signs. The developer, David Wenck, has not yet built the new house he planned. Perhaps the market shifted. Perhaps the permits are delayed. Perhaps he is waiting for the right buyer. Real estate moves slowly, but the lot is there. The dirt, the view. The same Gulf waters that Will Keith Kellogg looked at in 1935, straining his failing eyes to see the horizon. The locals know the story. If you ask someone in Dunedin about the Pink Mansion, they will tell you it was Kellogg's house, though most of them never saw it. They will tell you it was beautiful, though the photographs reveal a structure that was impressive, but not extraordinary. They will tell you it should have been saved, though none of them contributed money to save it. Memory is cheap. Preservation is expensive. But here is what actually remains. Every morning across the world, people pour milk over cereal. They do not think about Will Keith Kellogg. They do not think about the sanitarium in Battle Creek, the lawsuit against his brother, the mansion in Florida. They do not think about the blind old man wandering empty hallways. They eat, they go to work, they feed their children, and that is the legacy, not the house, but the habit. Kellogg did not just create a product, he created a behavior. He turned breakfast into a ritual that billions of people now perform without thought. He industrialized the morning. The foundation that bears his name continues this work in a different form. Where the cereal fed the body, the foundation feeds the future. Schools, clinics, research, programs that will outlive the buildings they occupy. This is the paradox of monuments. The physical ones decay. The systemic ones grow. The Villa Marina is gone. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation is thriving. The house lasted 88 years. The brand has lasted 118 years and counting. Which one was real? 10. Lessons from a demolished palace. What then is the lesson of Kellogg's Florida mansion? First, wealth is not the same as permanence. The richest men in the world cannot buy immortality for their possessions. Buildings rot. Estates are subdivided. Mansions become liabilities. Second, legacy is not located in objects. It is located in systems. Kellogg's real monument is not the house in Dunedin. It is the breakfast table in your home. It is the foundation that funds surgeries for children he will never meet. Third, the past does not preserve itself. Preservation requires constant investment, constant care, constant justification. The moment something stops being economically or culturally useful, it begins to die. Fourth, family is more fragile than empire. Kellogg could build a ACI company that employed thousands, but he could not repair his relationship with his son. He could donate millions to strangers, but he could not forgive the people closest to him. The skills that create wealth are not the skills that create love. Fifth, beauty without function is not enough. The Villa Marina was beautiful. The hand-painted ceilings were genuine art. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. But beauty does not pay property taxes. Beauty does not replace rotted beams. Beauty, in the end, is not an argument against demolition. And finally, the story of American capitalism is the story of creative destruction. Kellogg's mansion was destroyed by the same economic forces that built his empire. The market giveth, and the market taketh away. We are taught to mourn the loss of historic buildings. We are told that demolition is a tragedy, that we are losing our connection to the past. But the past does not care. The past is not a museum. The past is a process. Things are built. Things serve their purpose. Things decay. Things are replaced. Kellogg understood this. He spent his life optimizing systems, cutting costs, increasing efficiency. He would not have wanted his house to become a money pit. He would not have wanted resources wasted on preserving a structure that no longer functioned. He was a practical man in an impractical house. The house is gone. The man is gone. The empire continues. Every time you see that red signature on a box of cereal, you're seeing the real monument. Not stone, not plaster, not pink stucco that weathers in the Florida sun. A name, a brand, a promise. W.K. Kellogg. The stupid younger brother who ran beside his genius sibling's bicycle. The man who won. The excavator has moved on to other demolition sites. The workers have been paid. The lot on Buena Vista Drive is quiet again, the way it was before Kellogg, before Frischkorn, before the Marines, before the disco floor. The Gulf waters continue their rhythm. The sun rises and sets. The land waits for the next dreamer with enough money to build another monument that will, in time, also fall. This is the cycle. This is the machine. Kellogg fed it. The mansion fed it. And now the empty lot feeds it, waiting to be transformed again into something new, something temporary, something that believes itself permanent. The story is not over. The story is never over. It just changes form. Like corn into flakes, like labor into capital, like a palace into dust. If this investigation into the invisible architecture of American wealth, the psychology of self-made men, and the brutal mathematics of what history chooses to remember has given you something to consider, please like this video and subscribe. Your support allows for more of these deep examinations into the stories beneath the stories. Thank you for watching. Now go eat breakfast, and remember whose name you are reading. There exists a peculiar accounting problem that never appeared in any of the Kellogg Company's financial reports. A calculation that no bookkeeper ever attempted because the numbers involved could not be measured in dollars or production efficiency. The question was simple. How do you quantify the cost of winning everything and losing everyone? By 1940, Will Keith Kellogg controlled an empire that fed approximately 40 million Americans their breakfast every single morning. His factories in Battle Creek operated with the precision of Swiss watches. The signature on every box had become more recognizable than the signatures of half the presidents in American history. His net worth, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $2 billion in today's currency. But walk into that pink mansion in Dunedin during those years, past the imported tiles and the hand-painted beams, and you would find a man who ate dinner alone 7 nights a week. The servants kept meticulous records. These Documents preserved in the archives of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation tell a story that no promotional material ever mentioned. Between 1935 and 1942, during the years Kellogg owned the Villa Marina, the formal dining room was set for more than one person, exactly 8 times. 8 dinners in 7 years. Birthday celebrations for foundation executives, obligatory meetings with city officials. Each event noted in the household ledger with the cold precision of a tax document. The rest of the time, the table that could seat 20 held a single-place setting. Silver cutlery, fine china, crystal glassware. All the trappings of wealth arranged for an audience of one. What does a blind millionaire think about while eating alone in a palace? The staff reported that Kellogg rarely spoke during meals. He would touch his food carefully, identifying each item on the plate by texture and temperature before eating. The glaucoma that had stolen his vision had also stolen his ability to take pleasure in the visual presentation of food, that very pleasure his brother John Harvey had spent a lifetime condemning as sinful indulgence. The universe has a dark sense of humor. Kellogg's daily routine in Florida followed a pattern so rigid it could be measured with a stopwatch. He woke at precisely 6 in the morning. He refused assistance dressing himself, though it took him nearly 40 minutes to manage buttons and laces by touch alone. Breakfast at 7:15, always the same meal, a bowl of his own cornflakes with milk, 2 pieces of dry toast, black coffee. The irony was not lost on the kitchen staff. The man who had added sugar to cereal and made billions still ate his breakfast like a penitent monk. 8 o'clock to 11, he sat on the terrace. He could not see the bay, but he insisted on being positioned to face it. He listened to the water. He smelled the salt. He built a mental image from sound and scent, a ghost of the view he had purchased, but never truly possessed. The architectural firm that had designed the Villa Marina, Matthews and Howell, out of Tampa, had created elaborate sightlines throughout the house. Every major room offered a carefully framed view of either the bay, the garden, or the distant Gulf. These views were the entire point of the Mediterranean Revival style, the connection between interior luxury and natural beauty. Kellogg experienced none of it. He paid for sunset vistas he would never see. He owned beachfront property he could never safely walk alone. The house was a cruel joke, a mansion built for eyes by a man going blind. But here we must pause and examine a deeper truth, one that complicates the simple narrative of tragic irony. Because the evidence suggests that even before the glaucoma, even when his vision was perfect, Will Keith Kellogg did not actually enjoy visual beauty. He appreciated order. He valued efficiency. But aesthetic pleasure? That was his brother's territory, the realm of the sanitarium, with its manicured grounds and artistic pretensions. Will Keith Kellogg bought beauty because wealthy men were supposed to buy beauty. He purchased the Villa Marina, not because he loved architecture, but because owning a Florida mansion was the expected behavior for someone of his financial class in the 1930s. This realization transforms our understanding of the entire story. The tragedy was not that blindness took away his pleasure. The tragedy was that there was no pleasure to take away in the first place. The bedroom on the 3rd floor of the Villa Marina, the smallest of the 5, was referred to in household documents as the nursery. This designation appeared in insurance records, in the staff duty roster, in the architectural plans filed with the city. The nursery was never used. Let us examine this absence because it speaks to the deepest wound in the Kellogg family narrative, a wound that the Florida mansion was supposed to heal but only deepened. Will Keith Kellogg had 2 children, John Leonard Kellogg, Jr., born in 1892, and Elizabeth Ann Kellogg Williamson, born in 1895. By the time their father purchased the Villa Marina in 1934, John Jr. was 42 years old and Elizabeth was 39. Neither had given their father what wealthy patriarchs of that era obsessed over, a house full of grandchildren to secure the dynasty. The numbers are stark. John Jr. had one son, Kenneth. Elizabeth had no children. That was it. 2 children, 1 grandchild. This from a man whose product was marketed with images of large, happy families gathered around breakfast tables, children with milk mustaches grinning at bowls of golden flakes. The demographic reality of the Kellogg family directly contradicted the mythology of the Kellogg brand. Will Keith had built a 5-bedroom mansion with the unconscious assumption that families expand, that children multiply, that dynasties grow. The empty nursery was architectural evidence of a future that never materialized. The house was designed for Thanksgiving dinners with 3 generations, for summers when grandchildren would run through the halls and swim in the bay, for a kind of domestic abundance that existed only in the advertising department's imagination. What happened instead was litigation. The relationship between Will Keith and his son John Jr. deserves its own congressional investigation. The standard narrative, repeated in most biographies, focuses on John's divorce and remarriage as the trigger for his father's wrath. But court documents from the 1930s reveal a financial conflict far uglier than a simple moral disagreement. John Jr. had worked for the Kellogg Company since 1912. 24 years of service. He held multiple patents related to cereal production, including the wax coating process that kept flakes fresh. Under normal circumstances, these patents would have made him independently wealthy. But the patents were assigned to the company, not to John. Personally, standard practice for corporate employees. John Jr. spent 2 decades enriching his father's empire while receiving a comfortable but not extraordinary salary. He was promised, repeatedly according to his later testimony, that his loyalty would be rewarded with substantial ownership shares and a leadership position. Then came the divorce in 1934, the same year Will Keith bought the Villa Marina. The timeline is important. Will Keith fired his son from the company in January 1934. He purchased the Florida mansion in August 1934. These were not separate decisions. They were connected acts in a single psychological drama. The mansion was Will Keith's declaration that he no longer needed his biological family. If his children disappointed him, he would create a new legacy through philanthropy. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation, established in 1930, received its largest single donation in 1935, the year after John Jr.'s firing, an amount equivalent to approximately $650 million today. The message was clear. Other people's children would inherit his fortune. His own could fend for themselves. John Jr. sued multiple times. The court cases dragged through the late 1930s and into the 1940s. Father and son battled over employment contracts, patent rights, and eventually John Jr.'s children's right to inherit from their grandfather. Kenneth, the grandson who fell from the window, became a weapon in this war. Each side accused the other of using the boy as leverage. Will Keith claimed John Jr. was an unfit father who neglected his son. John Jr. claimed Will Keith was trying to steal his children through manipulation and money. The truth, buried in sealed family court documents, was probably that both accusations were accurate. Kenneth's fall occurred in 1943. He was 16 years old. The official story was an accident. He was leaning out a second-story window and lost his balance. He survived but suffered injuries that left him with permanent mobility issues. But whispers persisted. Depression, the pressure of being a Kellogg, the impossible weight of a surname that represented both immense wealth and complete family dysfunction. Biographers have speculated for decades whether the fall was truly an accident or something darker. The family never spoke publicly about it. Will Keith Kellogg was in California when it happened. He was 83 years old, almost completely blind, isolated in another mansion he rarely used. When informed of his grandson's injury, his response, according to foundation staff who were present, was to ask whether the boy would be able to work when he recovered, not whether he was in pain, not whether he would fully heal, whether he would be able to work. This is the man whose name smiles at you from the cereal aisle. Let us discuss the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, because this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, where the cynical narrative of a cruel capitalist collides with uncomfortable evidence of something more complex. In 1930, at the age of 70, Will Keith Kellogg did something almost unheard of for industrial tycoons of his generation. He gave away the majority of his wealth while still alive. Not in a deathbed conversion, not as a tax dodge, though the tax benefits were certainly part of the calculation. He created a foundation and funded it with his own company stock, transferring ownership and control to an entity whose purpose was to help children he would never meet. The initial endowment was valued at $47 million, equivalent to roughly $850 million today. By 1934, he had transferred additional assets, bringing the total to approximately $66 million, over $1 billion in current value. This represented more than 80% of his personal net worth. Stop and consider the mathematics. A man spends the first 46 years of his life in poverty and humiliation. He spends the next 30 years building an empire. And then, instead of hoarding his fortune or constructing a dynastic inheritance structure, he gives it away. Why? The standard explanation from Foundation hagiographies is that Kellogg was moved by the suffering of children during the Great Depression, that he saw poverty and decided to act, that his Adventist religious background instilled values of service and charity. All of this is partially true and deeply misleading. The economic reality was more calculating. By the 1930s, estate taxes on the wealthy had become punitive. The Revenue Act of 1935 imposed a tax rate of up to 70% on estates over $50 million. If Kellogg died without restructuring his assets, the federal government would claim the lion's share of his fortune, and whatever remained would be divided among children and grandchildren he increasingly viewed with contempt or indifference. The foundation was, among other things, a tax strategy. It allowed him to maintain control of his wealth through board appointments while ensuring the government and his disappointing family would receive as little as possible. But here is where it gets interesting. Because even if we grant the cynical interpretation, even if we assume the foundation was primarily a financial maneuver, the end result was that billions of dollars flowed into healthcare, education, and child welfare programs. Thousands of lives were saved. Millions were improved. Does motivation matter if the outcome is beneficial? This is the moral ambiguity at the heart of American philanthropy, and Will Keith Kellogg exemplifies it perfectly. He was not a kind man. He was not generous in the personal, emotional sense. He could not show affection to his own grandchildren, but he could write checks for other people's grandchildren. Enormous checks, transformative checks. The Foundation's early projects focused on rural health care. In the 1930s, vast swaths of America had no access to doctors, dentists, or hospitals. Child mortality in places like Appalachia and the Deep South was comparable to developing nations. The Kellogg Foundation funded mobile dental clinics, traveling nurses, and the construction of rural health centers. By 1942, Foundation-funded programs had provided dental care to over 175,000 children who had never seen a dentist. They had delivered vaccinations to remote communities, reducing child mortality by measurable percentages. These are not vague gestures. These are lives saved, documented in medical records and statistical analyses. Will Keith Kellogg saved more children through his foundation than most saints. He also fired his own son, ignored his grandson's suffering, and ate dinner alone in a mansion he could not see, seething with resentment at a world that had failed to appreciate him properly. Both things are true, simultaneously. This is the cognitive dissonance we must hold. The Villa Marina mansion in Florida was part of this same contradictory impulse. When Kellogg donated the house to the E. Foundation in 1937, he did so with specific instructions. He wanted it used for child welfare purposes. His exact vision was never clear, probably because he did not have one. He wanted the gesture of giving. The actual use was someone else's problem. The foundation tried. They considered turning it into a group home for orphans. They explored using it as a retreat center for social workers. They even briefly discussed converting it into a research facility for pediatric medicine. None of these plans made practical sense. The house was too large, too expensive to maintain, too isolated from population centers where services were needed. Within 5 years of receiving the property, the foundation's board was quietly discussing how to get rid of it. The mansion, like Kellogg's relationship with his family, was a grand gesture that solved nothing. Let us talk about the people who never appear in the photographs, the ones who actually kept the Villa Marina functioning while the corn. Flakes King sat on his terrace contemplating his various grievances. During the period of Kellogg's ownership, 1934 to 1937, the household staff consisted of approximately 8 to 12 people at any given time. The exact number fluctuated based on whether Kellogg was in residence or traveling. Their names appear in fragmentary payroll records, in city employment registries, in Social Security applications. There was Samuel Henderson, the head groundskeeper, an African-American man in his 50s who maintained the botanical gardens and the lawn. His salary in 1935 was $18 per week, equivalent to roughly $400 per week today. Skilled labor, but barely enough to support a family. There was Mary Kowalczyk, the head housekeeper, a Polish immigrant who managed the cleaning staff and inventory. $16 per week. She worked 6 days a week, 10 hours per day. No paid vacation, no sick leave. There was Ernesto Ruiz, the cook who had trained in Cuban restaurants before the revolution collapsed the tourism industry. $20 per week, the highest salary of the domestic staff. He prepared meals for a man who could barely taste them and who ate alone. These were not incidental details. These were lives. The economic structure of wealth in the 1930s, the structure that allowed men like Kellogg to build pink palaces, rested on a foundation of cheap labor. Servants in that era were paid wages that kept them perpetually on the edge of poverty, while the homes they maintained were valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The mathematical relationship was direct and brutal. The lower the labor costs, the more affordable the luxury. Kellogg's defenders and the Kellogg Company's modern corporate communications team are quick to point out that he was a progressive employer for his time. He implemented the 6-hour workday at his factories in 1930, one of the first major manufacturers to do so. He believed shorter hours increased productivity and gave workers time for education and family. This is documented fact. It is also true that the domestic servants in his Florida mansion worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week, for wages that barely covered rent. The contradiction is explained by class and visibility. Factory workers were part of the public brand. Their welfare could be marketed as proof of corporate responsibility. Domestic servants were invisible. They were part of the private sphere where the old rules still applied. Mary Kowalczyk's granddaughter, interviewed by a local Florida historian in 2003, remembered her grandmother's stories about the mansion. She described a house that was beautiful and cold. She said her grandmother respected Kellogg, but never felt respected in return. She said the old man treated the furniture with more care than he treated the people who cleaned it. One story stands out. In 1936, Mary Kowalczyk's daughter became seriously ill. Pneumonia. The family could not afford a hospital. Mary asked Kellogg, who was in residence at the time, for a loan against her wages to pay for medical care. Kellogg refused. He explained that lending money to employees created dependency and poor character. He suggested she apply to a charity clinic. The daughter survived, but the medical debt crushed the family's finances for years. Meanwhile, the man who refused a loan equivalent to perhaps $1,500 in today's currency was simultaneously donating millions to his foundation for child health care. The moral gymnastics required to hold these positions simultaneously are staggering, yet they were utterly typical of the wealthy class in that era. Systemic charity was virtuous. Personal obligation was weakness. The servants of the Villa Marina were present for all of it. They saw Kellogg wandering the halls at night when insomnia and old ghosts kept him awake. They saw him receive letters from his estranged son and throw them away unread. They saw him sit at the window, blind eyes, pointed at a view he could not see, for hours at a time without moving. They saw the loneliness, but they were not allowed to acknowledge it. Their job was to maintain the illusion that the mansion was a functioning home, not a mausoleum for a living man. When the house was sold in 1946, most of the staff were let go without severance. Standard practice. The new owners, the Nolans, brought in their own people. The workers who had maintained the property through its most famous period simply disappeared from the record, as servants always do. No plaques commemorate their labor, no tours mention their names. When the house was demolished in 2022, the news coverage focused on Kellogg's legacy and the loss of architectural history. Not one article mentioned the dozens of working-class people whose labor had kept that building standing. This is not an accident. This is how history is written. The names on the cereal boxes survive. The names on the payroll ledgers vanish. Let us zoom out. Stop looking at the Pink Mansion as an individual tragedy and start seeing it as a data point in a larger economic pattern that defined early 20th century America. Between 1920 and 1940, over 600 large private estates were built in Florida: Miami, Palm Beach, Sarasota, Naples, Dunedin. Each one represented a northern industrialist's attempt to import European aristocratic grandeur into a subtropical swamp. The total capital invested in these projects exceeded $3 billion in inflation-adjusted currency. This was not random. This was a coordinated class project. The wealthy of the 1920s faced a legitimacy crisis. America was supposed to be different from Europe. No inherited titles, no landed gentry. Just good, honest capitalism and the self-made man. But by the 1920s, industrial wealth had created a class of Americans who were functionally indistinguishable from aristocrats. They had more money than old European nobility. They had dynastic ambitions. They wanted palaces. But you cannot just call your house a palace in a democracy. That sounds un-American. So you build a winter estate. You frame it as practical, a health retreat from harsh northern winters. You fill it with Spanish tiles and Italian marble and pretend you are simply an appreciator of culture, not a baron building a castle. Florida became the solution to this ideological problem. It was far enough from the northern industrial cities that the contrast between worker tenements and owner estates was less visible. The climate justified the expense. The land was cheap because it had been violently taken from Seminole tribes only decades earlier, though this fact was not mentioned in the sales brochures. The Villa Marina was part of this wave. Kellogg's mansion was built during the peak of the Florida land boom, a speculative bubble so extreme that it makes the 2008 housing crisis look rational. Land prices in Miami increased by 1,000% between 1923 and 1925. Developers sold plots of land that were underwater, literally swamps, as waterfront property. Edward Frischkorn, the developer who originally built the house Kellogg would purchase, was a perfect example of this era's con artistry. His Dunedin Isles project was marketed as the American Riviera. The brochures showed golf courses and yacht clubs and happy families. The reality was mosquito-infested marshland and a half-finished golf course. Frischkorn's entire business model depended on finding a sucker with enough money to buy the dream before the dream collapsed. He found that sucker in the 1929 crash. Austin Seltz, his partner, got stuck holding the property when the bubble burst, and then Kellogg arrived, 5 years later, when prices had cratered. Kellogg was nobody's sucker. He bought the Villa Marina for a fraction of its construction cost. He got a mansion built with someone else's borrowed money, purchased at a bankruptcy discount. This is how fortunes that survive depressions are built. Patient capital, waiting for desperate sellers. The house was never about living. It was about asset acquisition. Kellogg understood that wealthy men were supposed to own Florida property. So he bought it, spent minimal time there, and ultimately donated it for a tax write-off. The entire transaction was economic theater. But here is where the story gets darker. Because while the Villa Marina and the 600 other estates were being built in the 1920s and 1930s, Florida was simultaneously constructing a different kind of architecture. Segregation. The same years that saw Mediterranean revival palaces rise in white neighborhoods saw the formalization of Jim Crow laws that prevented black Floridians from owning property in those same areas. Racial covenants written into property deeds explicitly forbade sale to anyone who was not white. Zoning laws pushed black communities into flood-prone areas without sewage systems. The beauty of places like Dunedin was constructed through the ugliness of racial exclusion. The pink walls of the Villa Marina were painted in a legal and social structure that said explicitly, "This beauty is not for everyone." Will Keith Kellogg was not a vocal racist. He was not a member of the Klan. By the standards of Northern industrialists, he was probably relatively progressive, a meaningless distinction. He hired black workers in his factories, though never in management. His foundation in its early years did fund some programs in black communities, though vastly less than in white ones. But he bought into a system, literally purchased property in a system, that depended on racial hierarchy. His mansion existed because the land it stood on was restricted. His gardens were maintained by workers who could not afford to live in the neighborhood where they worked. This is the context the nostalgia omits. When people lament the demolition of the Villa Marina, when they share black and white photographs of its elegant facade, they are mourning a building that was a physical manifestation of inequality. Not because Kellogg was uniquely evil, because the entire project of Florida estate building in that era was inseparable from racial capitalism and land theft. The mansion was not destroyed by a bulldozer in 2022. It was destroyed by history, by the slow collapse of the social order that made such buildings possible. The demolition was just the final paperwork. What happened to John Leonard Kellogg, Jr., the disgraced son, after his father's death in 1951? This is not a question most histories bother to answer. He is a footnote, the failed heir, the man who could not handle his father's empire. But he lived another 23 years, dying in 1974, and his life after exile is revealing. After being fired from the Kellogg Company in 1934, John Jr. tried repeatedly to rebuild. He consulted for other food companies, trading on his name and his expertise. He held patents. He understood cereal production as well as anyone alive. But the shadow of his father was inescapable. Business partners would get cold feet when they realized they were dealing with the exiled Kellogg son. Creditors assumed he had access to family wealth and charged accordingly. He had the burden of the name with none of its benefits. He eventually settled in California, far from Michigan and further from Florida. He worked as a mid-level food science consultant, comfortable but not wealthy. A man whose work had generated hundreds of millions of dollars, living on a salary. He gave one interview late in his life, 1972, to a graduate student researching the history of the breakfast cereal industry. The interview was never published, but the transcript survives in an academic archive. In it, John Jr. is asked whether he resents his father. His answer, "Resentment is a waste. He won. I didn't. That's just how it worked out. But I sleep fine at night, and I don't think he did." When pressed about the wax coating process he invented, which remained in use for decades and saved the company millions in spoilage, he shrugged it off. "I signed the papers. I knew what I was doing. You want to work for family? You pay a different kind of price." The interviewer asked whether he ever reconciled with his father before the old man's death. John Jr. laughed. "We were never not reconciled. You can't unreconcile with someone who never saw you as a separate person in the first place." This is perhaps the most psychologically astute thing anyone in the Kellogg family ever said on record. The problem was not hatred. The problem was that Will Keith Kellogg saw his children as extensions of himself, assets or liabilities in his broader life strategy. When they failed to perform their function, they were written off, the same way he would close an unprofitable factory. John Jr. died of heart failure in a modest house in Santa Barbara, surrounded by his second wife and a few friends. His obituary in the local paper was 4 sentences long. It did not mention his relationship to the cereal empire. It did not mention the patents or the years of labor. It noted only that he had worked in food science and was survived by his wife and 1 son. Kenneth, the grandson who fell from the window, outlived both his father and grandfather. He died in 1999 at the age of 72. He never worked in the food industry. He became a painter, a fact that seems almost deliberately symbolic. He created visual art while his grandfather went blind. Kenneth's paintings, when they occasionally appear at estate sales, are described by art dealers as technically competent but emotionally cold. Abstract geometric shapes, no people, no faces, no warmth. The psychological legacy of the Kellogg family rendered in acrylic on canvas. He never married. He never had children. The direct male lineage of Will Keith Kellogg died with him. The dynasty that the Villa Marina was supposed to house, the future generations that were supposed to fill those 5. Bedrooms never materialized. The family atomized. The blood descendants scattered and faded. But the W.K. Kellogg Foundation thrives. Its current asset value exceeds $8 billion. It funds research universities, public health initiatives, community development projects. It employs hundreds of people. It shapes policy. The artificial family outlived the biological one. The foundation, the cold legal entity, created as a tax shelter and a replacement for disappointing relatives, became the true heir. It will likely exist for another century, perhaps longer, distributing money to strangers according to algorithms and grant applications. This is the strange immortality of capital. Kellogg failed at every human relationship he attempted, but he succeeded at creating a perpetual money machine that bears his name. Which form of legacy is more real? The Villa Marina could not answer that question. So it was demolished. The land will be subdivided. New houses will be built. Smaller, modern, occupied by people who have never heard of Will Keith Kellogg. The bay will still be there. The sunset will still paint the water golden pink. But the mansion, the monument to ambition and emptiness, the pink palace that was supposed to mean something, is gone, and the world continued, as it always does.